I stared at my phone for 8 full days before the cold, hollow realization finally settled in my chest. My family wasn't going to call. Not my mother, who could spend 4 hours discussing the precise viscosity of a new dermal filler, and certainly not my father, who viewed anything less than a board-certified surgeon as a statistical error in the family tree. My 31st birthday had passed in a deafening silence that no amount of Chicago city noise could drown out. I spent the evening exactly as I had spent the last 6, sitting at a kitchen table held together by industrial duct tape, eating a lukewarm slice of pepperoni pizza over a cardboard box, and watching the blue light of the television flicker against the walls of my cramped apartment. In my family, I was a ghost. To the elite circle of the North Shore, the Chen-Dixon legacy was built on the palace of plastic, my parents' multi-million-dollar aesthetic empire. My sister Camilla was the heir apparent, the golden child whose every promotion was toasted with vintage Cristal. My father, Arthur, often called my life flight helicopter a meat wagon. To him, I wasn't an emergency medical professional. I was a high-speed courier for bodies that were already broken beyond repair. All that potential, my mother Evelyn would sigh, and you chose to spend your life smelling like jet fuel and other people's tragedies. But as I sat there, the pizza crust tasting like ash, the ABC News 7:00 p.m. special flashed a familiar silhouette across the screen. It was a jagged vachta outside the city, slick with black ice and a February gale. There, dangling from a steel cable beneath a Kaio helicopter, was a figure in a dark flight suit. It was me. I was the one reaching into the wreckage of a crushed SUV to pull a 17-year-old girl named Lila back from the brink of the abyss. My family saw a driver. The city was seeing an architect of survival. They called me a disgrace. But tonight, the world was about to see what happens when the invisible daughter is the only thing standing between a child and the grave. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 25% right now, right? If that's true, type 8. If not, type 9. Let's see whether I got it right. All right. Enough talking. Let's begin the story. The silence of those 8 days wasn't just a lapse in memory. It was the natural conclusion to a history of calculated indifference that began long before I ever stepped onto a helicopter. Growing up in Winnetka, within the sterile, white-on-white perfection of my parents' estate, you learned quickly that in the Chen-Dixon household, children weren't just family, they were brand extensions. My mother, Evelyn, didn't use the fiery language of typical arguments. She used the icy, clinical precision of an auditor. I can still hear the rhythmic clicking of her manicured nails against the marble kitchen island as she reviewed our quarterly achievements like they were stock reports. It was there, amidst the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax, that the narrative of my life was written for me. By the time I was 18, the divide in our value was no longer a feeling. It was a financial ledger. I remember the morning Camilla turned 16. A white G-Wagon was waiting in the driveway, tied with a silk ribbon that cost more than my entire first-year tuition. My parents toasted her natural grace and marketable future, already mapping out her path through the finest medical schools to take over the family empire. When it was my turn to head to university, there was no ribbon and no car. There was only a stack of brochures for student loans, and a cold reminder from my father that they had already invested heavily in Camilla's guaranteed success. He looked at me with a detached disappointment, as if I were a piece of equipment that had arrived with a permanent manufacturer's defect. "Stella is our only failed investment," my mother would say to her bridge club, her voice projecting just enough to ensure I heard it from the hallway. To them, my fascination with trauma, medicine, and fieldwork wasn't a noble pursuit. It was a rebellious descent into service work that embarrassed their elite social standing. They didn't just ignore my career. They mourned it as if I had died and been replaced by a stranger in a sweat-stained flight suit. While Camilla was being thoten on the honorary boards of their private clinics, my existence was being quietly scrubbed from the family's public-facing life. I became the daughter they only mentioned in hushed, apologetic tones, the one who chose the grime of the streets over the glamour of the palace. This was the foundation of the Chen-Dixon legacy, a palace built on the beauty of the surface, hiding a basement where they stored the failures like me. The favoritism in our house wasn't a series of accidents. It was a carefully curated architecture designed to elevate Camilla while ensuring I remained the foundation she walked upon. It was most evident in the way my parents celebrated milestones. When Camilla was appointed as the junior lead of their North Shore clinic, my father, Arthur, threw a gala at the Union League Club of Chicago that cost more than my entire 4-year degree. I remember standing in a corner, wearing a dress I'd found at a consignment shop, watching them present her with the keys to a white Mercedes G-Wagon. They toasted her marketable brilliance and unwavering commitment to the family legacy, their eyes shining with a pride that never seemed to find its way to my side of the room. While Camilla was being handed the keys to a life of luxury, I was receiving automated calls from Navient about my student loan interest. My parents hadn't paid for my paramedic training not because they couldn't afford it, but because they viewed it as a hobby of the commoners that didn't warrant their capital. Every time I picked up a triple shift at Life Flight to keep my head above water, my mother, Evelyn, would look at my exhausted, dark-circled eyes and ask why I couldn't just act like a Dixon and find a job that didn't require me to wear boots. In their world, effort was only valuable if it resulted in a headline or a high-end cosmetic contract. My exhaustion was viewed as a personal failure of style, while Camilla's stress from managing a social media schedule was treated like a heroic sacrifice. The most cutting part of this structure, however, was the way I was introduced to their elite circle. At the annual Christmas dinner, Arthur would lead Camilla around the room like a prize-winning mayor, introducing her as the future of Chicago aesthetics. When people finally turned to me, his smile would thin, his voice dropping into a register of polite apology. "And this is Stella," he'd say, as if disclosing a mild tax penalty. "She's in transportation with the city." He couldn't even bring himself to say I saved lives, because in his mind, saving a heart that couldn't pay for a facelift was a waste of professional talent. I was the other Dixon, the shadow in the corner of the family portrait, the one kept just far enough away so as not to ruin the lighting on the golden daughter. They didn't just favor her, they financed her reality at the expense of my dignity, building a palace for her while leaving me to find my own shelter in the storm. If the palace of plastic was my prison of invisibility, the helipad at Life Flight Chicago was the only place I finally felt like I occupied space. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes when you're standing on a concrete roof at 3 a.m, the freezing wind off Lake Michigan whipping against your flight suit, while the turbines of a Eurocopter EC-135 begin to scream. To my mother, the smell of jet fuel was a social embarrassment, a scent she tried to mask with layers of Chanel No. 5. To me, it was the smell of purpose. In the air, there are no failed investments or brand extensions. There is only the patient, the monitor, and the terrifyingly beautiful responsibility of keeping a soul tethered to this earth. Inside that cockpit, my value isn't measured by a quarterly profit margin or the symmetry of a patient's jawline. It's measured by the steadiness of my hands during a needle thoracostomy while we're banking hard over the loop. My primary witness in this world is Elias Vance, a man who has spent more hours in the air than my father has spent in his gilded surgery suite. Elias is a man of few words, a 60-year-old pilot who wears his experience in the deep lines around his eyes, but he sees me in a way the Chen Dixon family never bothered to. He was the one who, on that 8th day of silence following my birthday, quietly placed a single, slightly smashed grocery store cupcake on the dashboard of the Bird. He didn't sing, he didn't make a scene. He just gave me a gruff nod and said, "You're the best medic I've ever flown with, Dixon. Don't let the ground dwellers get in your head." Then there is Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief of trauma, a man who commands the same respect my father craves, yet earns it through grit rather than gala invitations. In the trauma bay, when the doors burst open and the meat wagon arrives, Thorne doesn't see a glorified driver. He sees the person who caught the subtle signs of attention pneumothorax when the clock was running out. He values my hands because they are practical, scarred, and capable, not because they are aesthetic. Life Flight is my sanctuary, because it is the only place where the Dixon name is irrelevant. Here, I am enough exactly as I am. While my family was busy mourning the disgrace of my career, I was building a life in the clouds where status is a luxury no one can afford, and where being just a paramedic means being the most important person in the room on someone's worst day. Thanksgiving at the Chen Dixon estate was never about gratitude. It was a high-stakes theatrical production of the perfect American dynasty, and I was the only cast member who refused to follow the script. I walked into the Winnetka mansion at 6:15 p.m., straight from a grueling 14-hour rotation that had ended with us airlifting a cardiac patient through a wall of sleet. I hadn't had time to change. I stood in the grand foyer, my heavy flight boots leaving faint damp prints on the hand-tufted Persian rug, my dark navy flight suit smelling of recycled oxygen, and the sharp metallic tang of an emergency bay. There was a dried smear of blood on my left cuff. Type O negative. The remnants of a life I'd helped hold together 3,000 feet in the air. But to my mother, Evelyn, it was simply a biohazard ruining her white-on-white holiday aesthetic. The dinner table was a masterpiece of clinical luxury, lit by beeswax candles that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Preston, Camilla's fiancé, was already deep into his third glass of vintage Bordeaux, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who moved money around and called it building the world. He leaned back, his eyes raking over my uniform with a smirk that didn't even try to hide its contempt. "So, Stella," he began, his voice projecting across the table to ensure the audience was listening. "Did the meat wagon bring in anything interesting today? Or was it just another day of playing Uber for the uninsured?" Camilla let out a soft, tittering laugh, shielding her mouth with a silk napkin, while my sisterly golden child looked at me with a pity that felt like a slap. I felt the heat rise in my throat, the exhaustion of the shift suddenly sharpening into a cold, hard anger. "I saved a father of 3 today, Preston," I said, my voice steady, despite the tremor in my hands. "I did a field intubation while the bird was banking 30 degrees. What did you do? Hedge a bet against a failing hospital chain?" The room went silent, the only sound, the soft clinking of silver against china. Camilla's hand immediately flew to her throat in a practiced gesture of distress. "Stella, please," she whispered, her eyes brimming with calculated tears. Preston was just joking. "Why do you always have to be so combative? You're ruining the first holiday we've had together in months." Then my father's voice cut through the room like a surgical blade, cold and final. Arthur didn't look at Preston's rudeness. He looked at my stained uniform. "Stella, your presence at this table is a choice, not a right," he said, setting his wine glass down with a definitive click. "You've brought the grime of your workplace into this home and then insulted our guest. Preston is part of this family's future. You are currently a guest in it. Apologize to him right now so we can finish this meal in peace." My mother nodded in silent agreement, her face a mask of sterilized disappointment. In that moment, standing on the edge of their pristine, hollow world, I realized I wasn't just a failed investment to them. I was an intruder. I was being forced to bow at the altar of their silence, to apologize for the very grit and blood that made me real, just to keep their fragile, plastic peace intact. The aftermath of that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner wasn't marked by an explosion of anger. Instead, it was characterized by a clinical sterilization of my remaining ties to the Dixon name. My father, Arthur, was never a man of theatrical outbursts. He was a man of fine print and fiduciary duty. 3 days after I walked out of the Winnetka mansion, I didn't receive a phone call or a half-hearted apology. Instead, I received a thick, cream-colored envelope delivered to the Lifelight hangar by a private courier. It was a formal notification from the Dixon Family Living Trust. In 12 pages of dense legalese, my father hadn't just cut me off financially. He had performed a social lobotomy, officially moving my name to the excluded schedule of the family's future assets. I went to the North Shore Clinic the following afternoon, ostensibly to pick up some tax documents I'd left in the safe, but really to see if the erasure was as total as the paperwork suggested. The wall of honor in the lobby, which featured portraits of the Dixon surgeons through 3 generations, had already been adjusted. The small, candid photo of me, in my paramedic graduation gown, the only image of me that had ever been allowed in the building, had been replaced by a sleek digital display, showcasing Camilla's latest Vogue feature. I was being scrubbed from the narrative in real time. As I stood there, I overheard my mother, Evelyn, in the consultation lounge, speaking with Mrs. Montgomery, one of the city's most influential philanthropists and a key donor to the Dixon Aesthetic Foundation. "And how is Stella doing?" Mrs. Montgomery asked, her voice carrying across the hushed, lavender-scented room. I froze, my hand on the handle of the records office door. "Stella is doing quite well," my mother replied, her tone as smooth and artificial as the Botox she dispensed. "She's taking a sabbatical from her more active pursuits. She's currently working as a junior administrative clerk for a city logistics firm. We felt it was best for her to gain some ground-level experience before she rejoins the family office." She didn't just lie, she demoted my entire existence to a clerical error. To her, admitting her daughter hung from helicopters to save the dying was a disgrace that required a cover story. I wasn't an elite trauma professional to them. I was an embarrassment that needed to be rebranded as a low-level paper pusher to maintain the optics of their tin-ho world. I walked out of that building without the documents, the metallic taste of betrayal sharp in my mouth. They hadn't just taken my inheritance, they had stolen my story, my sweat, and the 6 years I'd spent bleeding for the people of Chicago, all so they could tell their friends that the Dixon legacy remained pure. This was the great sin, the realization that, to my own blood, my reality was a stain that needed to be bleached white, no matter the cost to my soul. The administrative clerk lie was the final brick in the wall my parents built to keep my reality out of their sight, but the life flight hangar at O'Hare didn't recognize their blueprints. Returning to the airfield after that week felt like waking up from a suffocating, lavender-scented fever dream into a world of cold wind and absolute truth. The white-on-white perfection of Winnetka was gone, replaced by the industrial gray of the hangar and the low, comforting hum of a turbine being serviced. Elias Vance didn't ask how the Dixon family dinner went. He didn't need to. He simply handed me a thermos of coffee, black, bitter, and real, and watched me with the steady, unblinking gaze of a man who had flown through more storms than my father had ever seen. "Ground dwellers always try to pull the birds down, Stella," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "But they forget we know the way back up." I was prepping my kit for a transfer to Cook County when Dr. Eris Thorne walked into the crew room. Thorne was the antithesis of my father. He was a man of jagged edges and surgical miracles, a trauma legend who wore his exhaustion like a medal. He wasn't there to discuss optics or family legacies. He walked straight to the table where I was checking the seals on a chest tube kit and tapped a heavy manila folder against the metal surface. For a moment, he just looked at me, his eyes searching mine with a clinical intensity that felt more like love than anything Evelyn had ever offered. "I heard about the North Shore Gala," Thorne said, his voice a low rasp, "and I heard the story your mother is telling the donor board about your sabbatical as a clerk." I felt the familiar heat of shame rise in my chest, but Thorne held up a hand to stop it. He opened the folder and slid a document across the table. It was a copy of a letter, 3 pages, of dense, professional praise addressed to the National Board of Air Medicine. My name was at the top, but the words beneath it were unrecognizable to the girl who had been called a failed investment just days prior. "I didn't nominate you because you're a Dixon, Stella. I nominated you because when Lila was dangling off that vatch da and the wind was trying to rip the cable out of your hands, you didn't look at the optics," Thorne said, his voice hardening with a fierce, quiet pride. "You looked at the patient. You stayed when gravity told you to let go. That isn't just a driver. And it sure as hell isn't a clerical error." He leaned in, his hands scarred and steady resting on the folder. "Your parents are clinically blind, Stella. They've spent so much time fixing surfaces that they've lost the ability to see anything beneath them. But this committee? They see you. The governor's office sees you. And next Saturday at the Drake, the whole city is going to see exactly what you're made of." Standing in that drafty hangar, With the weight of Thorne's respect pressing against me, the excluded status of the Dixon Living Trust felt suddenly, beautifully irrelevant. I wasn't alone in the storm anymore. I had an architect of justice standing in my corner, and he was handing me a microphone I hadn't even known I was holding. The Dixon family had erased my name from their palace, but Dr. Eris Thorne had just written it into the history of the city. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now, while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. All right, enough talking. Let's begin the story. I carried Dr. Thorne's manila folder like a shield, the weight of his respect providing a fleeting sense of armor as I returned to the Winnetka estate one final time. I wasn't there for a reconciliation. I was there to reclaim the only things they hadn't yet managed to sterilize: my birth certificate, my original nursing license, and a few blurred photographs of my grandmother. The house was unnervingly quiet, the foyer smelling of expensive white tea, and the suffocating stillness of a life lived for appearances. But as I reached the top of the gallery stairs, the silence was punctured by the sharp, melodic chime of Camilla's laughter coming from my mother's sunroom. I stopped, the cold marble beneath my boots anchoring me to the shadows of the hallway. I shouldn't have stayed to listen, but the mention of my name, spoken with a casual, flippant malice, froze the air in my lungs. Honestly, Mom, Camilla was saying, her voice carrying that practiced, rhythmic lilt she used for her influencers. The timing was almost too perfect. Stella dangling from that cable, the bound twit, the little girl Lila looking so pathetic for the ABC cameras. It was such a calculated vignette, wasn't it? I felt a new kind of chill. One that jet fuel and Chicago winters couldn't explain. My mother's response was a low, conspiratorial hum. "It's a desperate play for the Living Trust, Camilla," Evelyn replied, her tone devoid of any maternal warmth, sounding instead like a bored judge. "She knows she's been excluded, so she's performing these heroics to guilt your father into a payout. She thinks if she plays the martyr for a commoner's child, we'll feel obligated to bring her back into the fold. As if we'd trade the family's prestige for a girl who's clearly just looking for a social media payout through her so-called trauma." This was the second twist, the deeper betrayal I hadn't seen coming. They didn't just ignore my work, they had projected their own moral bankruptcy onto me. Because they lived a life of staged perfections and bought narratives, they truly believed my sacrifice was a stunt, and Lila's life was merely a prop for my extortion. They didn't just dislike my career, they were fundamentally incapable of believing in a world where a person would bleed for someone else without a price tag attached. Standing there in the dark, I realized that the people who shared my DNA were more alien to me than any stranger I'd ever rescued. They hadn't just lost their sight, they had lost their humanity. And for the first time, the failed investment tag didn't hurt, it felt like a badge of absolute, beautiful separation. The following Saturday, Chicago was gripped by a biting lake-effect wind, but inside the Gold Coast room of the Drake Hotel, the air was thick with the scent of historical dignity, and the quiet hum of people who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. I stood before the full-length mirror in the dressing room, smoothing the fabric of the emerald green silk gown. It was the most expensive thing I had ever owned, a $2,500 investment in a version of myself that didn't need to ask for permission to exist. The color made my skin glow and my eyes look like flint, but more importantly, it felt like armor. As I pinned my Life Flight commendation pin to the clutch bag, I realized I wasn't shaking. The girl who had spent 31 years waiting for a seat at the Dixon table had finally left the room. Exactly 6 blocks away, at the ultra-modern Alinea, my family was settling into a 12-course tasting menu to celebrate Camilla's ascension to the family throne. I could see it in my mind with terrifying clarity. Arthur at the head of the table, Preston swirling a glass of vintage burgundy, and my mother, Evelyn, basking in the reflected glow of her golden child. They were in a world where the only thing that mattered was the prestige of the surface, unaware that the very news cycle they relied on to validate their status was about to tear their mask apart. They believed they were the headline of the night, while I was supposedly tucked away in a clerical office, filing the paperwork of my own failure. At 6:45 p.m., Dr. Eris Thorne and Elias Vance met me in the lobby. Elias looked uncomfortable but proud in a rented tuxedo, his pilot's wings polished to a mirror finish. Thorne took my hand, his surgical grip steadying and real. "You ready, Stella?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of confidence. "I've been ready for 6 years, Eris," I replied. As the clock struck 7:00 p.m., the National Board of Air Medicine Gala officially began, and the ABC News special Heroes of the Sky went live to millions of households, including the sleek, wall-mounted monitors in the lounge at Alinea. The two worlds were no longer separate. They were on a collision course. While my father was likely preparing a toast to Camilla's flawless leadership, the screen behind him was flickering to life with a jagged silhouette of a life flight helicopter. The quiet, calculated separation I had felt in the dark hallway of Winnetka was about to become a public manifestation. I wasn't just walking onto a stage at the Drake. I was walking into the center of their reality, and this time, they wouldn't be able to look away. The Gold Coast room at the Drake fell into a clinical, heavy silence as the lights dimmed, and the ABC News logo flickered onto the massive projectors. Standing at the edge of the stage, the weight of the emerald silk against my skin felt like the only thing keeping me grounded. Across the room, the Minister of Health and the city's elite sat in rapt attention, but my mind was 6 blocks away, inside the hushed, minimalist interior of Alinea. I could almost hear the clink of silver against fine china stop as the Heroes of the Sky segment began. The screen showed the jagged skyline of Chicago, then cut to the raw, terrifying footage of the bound twit, rescue the helicopter chowdow, the howling gale, and there I was, a dark silhouette dangling over a 300-foot drop, refusing to let go of a crushed SUV. The voice of Lila, the 17-year-old girl I had pulled from the wreckage, filled the room and the monitors at Alinea. "The doctors said I shouldn't be here," she whispered over a background of heart monitors. But Stella didn't look at the stats. She didn't look at the storm. She just looked at me and said, "Not today, Lila. She is the reason I'm breathing." I imagined my father, Arthur, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips, as the daughter he called a meat wagon driver was described as an architect of life by a child the city now adored. I imagined my mother, Evelyn, watching her administrative clerk lie disintegrate in real time before her North Shore peers. When the minister called my name, the standing ovation was a wall of sound that felt more real than 31 years of Winnetka silence. I stepped to the microphone, the Crystal National Valor Award heavy and cold in my hands. I didn't look at the cameras for the news. I looked into the lens for them. I grew up in a house where medicine was about the surface, the symmetry of a face, the prestige of a name, the viscosity of a filler. I began, my voice steady, carrying the weight of the 14-hour shifts and the jet fuel-scented nights. I was told my work was a disgrace because it was dirty. I was told I was just a driver because I chose the grime of the trauma bay over the glamour of the palace. 6 blocks away, the atmosphere at Alinea fractured. I later learned from a server that the silence in the restaurant was so absolute you could hear the buzz of the monitors. As I spoke the words "failed investment," my mother, Evelyn, gasped, a piece of dry-aged Wagyu catching in her throat as the realization hit everyone in that restaurant. Their donors, their rivals, and Preston's family were watching the Dixon family's shame being hailed as a national treasure. She choked, her face turning a panicked shade of red, a physical manifestation of the lie she could no longer swallow. "But tonight," I continued, my gaze piercing the camera, "I realize that you don't need a seat at a table that doesn't value your soul. Being a paramedic isn't about transportation. It's about being the person who stays when everyone else has a reason to leave. I don't just transport bodies. I carry the souls that the elite of this city have deemed too expensive or too messy to save." I set the microphone down on the stand, no slam, no theatrics, just the quiet, definitive click of a job finished. As I walked off that stage, I knew the Dixon Empire wasn't just being challenged. It was being deconstructed by the very truth they had tried to bleach away. The silence inside Alinea didn't just linger, it solidified into a physical weight that seemed to crush the very oxygen out of the room. I later learned from Elias, who had a contact in the building, that for 3 full minutes, the only sound was the low, electric hum of the monitors displaying my face, the face of the daughter they had tried to bury, in a clerical office. The law of karma didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It arrived with the soft, devastating sound of social distance. Preston was the first to feel the foundation crumble. His phone, usually a tool of arrogant power, began to vibrate incessantly against the mahogany table like a trapped insect. 2 of his primary investors, men who valued the optics of heroism as much as they did profit, had been watching the ABC stream. By the time the main course was served, Preston's groundbreaking hedge fund project was being liquidated in a series of urgent, cold text messages. No one wanted to be tethered to a man who had publicly insulted a national hero for the sake of a tablecloth. But the professional ruin was only the beginning of the architecture of their collapse. Camilla, the golden child whose ascension was supposed to be the headline of the night, sat in the center of the wreckage. The senior partners at the table, surgeons who had spent their lives building a reputation for healing, began to look at her, not with admiration, but with the clinical disgust one reserves for a contaminated specimen. They didn't offer a toast. They offered excuses, one by one sliding their chairs back and exiting the restaurant before the bill even arrived. The Dixon name, which had been a currency of prestige just hours ago, had become a social contagion. The most visceral manifestation of the truth, however, occurred as my mother, Evelyn, tried to stand. The Wagyu bit tet she had been struggling to swallow finally won. Her choking wasn't just a physical accident. It was the physical manifestation of a lie she could no longer digest. As she gasped for air, her face turning a terrifying shade of purple, the irony was absolute. In a room full of elite surgeons and aesthetic specialists, no one moved. My father, Arthur, was paralyzed by the sudden, public death of his ego. It was the waitstaff, the service workers Evelyn so deeply despised, who rushed forward to perform the Heimlich maneuver. It was the meat wagon she had mocked that was paged to the scene. As the paramedics from the very city service I represented wheeled my mother out of the 3-star restaurant on a stretcher, the cameras she had craved for Camilla's glory were now fixed on her own moment of profound vulnerability. The Dixon family was left standing in the ruins of a celebration that had turned into a funeral for their reputation. They had spent 31 years trying to bleach my life out of their narrative, only to find that my truth was the only thing that could have saved them from the darkness they had created for themselves. The elite were now the outcasts, and the daughter they had excluded was the only one whose name still held value in the streets of Chicago. I stood on the helipad of LifeFlight Chicago at 5:45 a.m., watching the first jagged shards of gold light pierce the gray skin of the lake. The city below was waking up, oblivious to the fact that the Dixon dynasty had been deconstructed in a single news cycle. My phone sat on the concrete ledge beside me, vibrating with a desperate, rhythmic frequency. There were 17 missed calls from my father, Arthur, and a string of frantic, rambling texts from my mother, Evelyn, pleading for a private family summit to mitigate the misunderstanding. For 31 years, I had lived for the vibration of that phone, hoping for a crumb of recognition. But as I looked at the screen, I felt nothing but a clean, cold distance. I didn't need to answer. I had already spoken my truth on a stage they couldn't ignore. And for the first time, my silence wasn't a product of their suppression. It was a manifestation of my power. "Ready to go back up, Dixon?" Elias Vance called out, his voice a low, comforting rasp as he finished his pre-flight walk-around. He didn't ask about the gala or the fallout at Alinea. He just looked at my emerald, green silk dress, now draped over a chair in the locker room, and then at the dark navy flight suit I had stepped back into. To the Dixon family, this suit was a disgrace, but as I zipped it up, it felt like the only skin I had ever truly owned. I picked up my phone, scrolled through the names that had once defined my prison, and performed the final, most necessary surgery of my life. One by one, I blocked them: Arthur, Evelyn, Camilla, Preston. I wasn't doing it out of spite. I was doing it for the same reason I monitored a patient's airway to ensure I could breathe. Setting a boundary isn't an act of revenge. It is an act of architecture. I was finally building a life where the failed investment tag was a relic of a dead language. As I climbed into the cockpit and felt the familiar, violent thrum of the turbines beneath my feet, I looked down at the Winnetka estate, a tiny hollow speck of white on the horizon. They could keep their palace of plastic and their tables full of prestige and silence. I had my sanctuary in the clouds, my chosen family in the trauma bay, and a seat at a table where the only thing that mattered was the soul I was helping to save. I was Stella, a flight trauma paramedic, and I was finally, beautifully, enough. As the bird lifted off and we vaulted into the dawn, I realized I didn't need them to see me anymore because I finally saw myself. This story, while a journey of one woman in Chicago, reflects a universal truth about the architecture of our lives. Your value is never determined by the people who are committed to misreading you. We are often taught that blood is the ultimate bond, a sacred contract that excuses any betrayal, but Stella's journey reminds us that family is a verb, not just a noun. It is defined by who shows up in the storm, not who sits at the head of a gilded table. The most profound lesson here is that setting a boundary is not an act of malice, it is an act of preservation. When you stop allowing toxic people to define your narrative, you aren't ruining a family, you are reclaiming your soul. Stella spent 31 years as a failed investment in her parents' ledger, only to realize that their ledger was fundamentally bankrupt. Real wealth isn't found in the symmetry of a face or the prestige of a name. It's found in the grit of the trauma bay, the loyalty of a flight crew, and the courage to stand alone until you find people who truly see you. Resilience is not just about surviving the banquet. It's about refusing to let the coldness of others settle in your bones. If you are currently sitting at a table 14 inches your own life, remember that you have the power to stand up, walk out, and build your own sanctuary in the clouds. You are enough. Not because of what you provide for others, but because of the person you are when no one is watching. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose your own worth over a family member's approval? Have you ever found that chosen family was stronger than the one you were born into? Leave a comment below. Your story might be the light someone else needs to find their way out of the dark. If Stella's journey resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to join our community. We share stories of resilience, justice, and the courage to be enough every week. Thank you for staying until the end.